reality of life. I'm sure we all go there at times, but I have a niece right now who is in the last possibly days to weeks of her life. And so I know that her children, she's got teenagers that are going in and seeing her in the hospital. And I try to imagine, and some of you here probably walked it, but I try to imagine what it must be like to look in the face of your children as they're crying and say, "Don't go, Mom." And how much she doesn't want to go. And yet she can't stop it. And I just thought, life is such a tragedy, isn't it? Life is such a tragedy. And you think, that's just one little piece of the tragedy of life. And I just thought, if life is truly, like some people say, if this is all there is, oh my goodness, what a sorrowful, broken tragedy that is. The only thing that keeps that from overwhelming me is the fact that I believe she knows who Christ is. And there's hope. And I keep thinking, why in the world would we want to live a life where it's just a tragedy? Why would we settle for that? Why would we even want to embrace that kind of concept? And I was also thinking, why in the world would we be born into a place by accident where we learn to passionately love each other and then lose each other? Why in the world doesn't that just sound futile to you? Doesn't that just sound like a ridiculous thought?
It's a cruel joke.
It is a cruel, cruel joke. If that's all it is, then life is just simply that. It's a bad tragedy. Fortunately, I believe that's not it. Otherwise, I would be in despair. But that's not what it is, and that's why I just feel so badly for people who believe it is. Because if you really look at what we're here, the reality of our life and the fact that we interact day by day, there's some people that I love passionately. Why would I go to all of that pain and suffering and joy that is the complete ends of the spectrum, absolute joy and absolute suffering because you love someone so much, to just lose them and be done? No. I refuse to believe that. I refuse to live like that. Some might say that I'm in a pretend world. Well, fine, so be it then, because I do not want to live in a tragic world and have it only be tragedy. That's just complete pessimism and really torture is really all it is. And as she said, it's a really bad joke. So I really think that as I look at this, I've thought so much about what we talked about last week, trying to get a hold on what is our faith? Why are we people of faith? And what does our faith mean? And what does it mean to not have it? First of all, and I just thought that's the tragedy for those who don't have it. And I want to make sure that I do understand that Christ understood that when he came into this world. He understood what a tragedy this world is without him. And how terrible. I think of my brother and his daughter, and then the kids, and having to explain, Mom's leaving, if that's all it was, and I can imagine how Christ felt. When he's talking to some of these people and they thought that's all it is. You don't know that I'm here to give you, to take care of the tragedy for you. I'm going to fix the tragedy. And you don't even want it. You don't want to embrace it. You want to live in that? It's so mind-boggling to me. And I can imagine to him it was as well. So I want to look at this and go further today. As you can see on your notes, as I said earlier, if you were not here last week and you want the notes from last week, I have them, but I did just a short synopsis of what was on the notes last week there on the review. And I started out talking about what is religion, and I'm using religion in a very loose term, simply because it's kind of a broad perspective, and really simply because that's the way they viewed it at the time of Christ. They saw it as the religion of the Jews, right? Judaism was that, and I've defined it there for you as it means devout, or the diligent performance of divinely described duties of outward service to God. That's what they did. That's what Judaism was. And then I went on to talk about how we get confused in our cultures. Different cultures get confused about what that means. And in our current culture, I talked last week about 3 men who were complete atheists, but they did affect the thought process of even the way we approach religion today, our own religion of Christianity. And I hate that term, but you know why I'm using that term. Because we know that it's a relationship. We know that it's more than just a set of rules that you follow, but yet many people consider it to be that, and we can see it in comparison to what was in the New Testament, how you could use that term. But these men, they believed that life was just simply a tragedy. They did. These atheists believed that life was just simply, you live, you die, that's it. And so from that, they got some perspectives on why religion is even a part of our life, why we even have beliefs, whether they be Christian or otherwise. And they came up with some conclusions about what God does for the person who can't accept that life is just simply a big tragedy. Why do we, and to them, that's what they did, that's what they believed, is that we really just, God, we're not made in God's image, we made God in our image. We've thought God up to really deal with this tragic play that we're in called life. And that's the way they saw it. And so they saw religion as just, I'm not going to go back over each one of them, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud. And there were many others that took their baton and traveled with it, that created some mindsets that we have in our world today, which are still some of the basic questions that people will answer, or people will ask regarding, if there's a God, why does this happen? If there's a God, why would this make sense? You know, those questions. These kinds of men put that thought in our culture. That's what breeds those kinds of questions. Because back in the times of Judaism, back in the times of Jesus, they never would have thought such a thing. Because they all believed in gods, right? It's only a culture where you begin to remove yourself and actually be able to consider that there might not be a God, and that this is just a big tragedy, that you could ask those kinds of questions. And really, the reason they could ask those questions now is because we went through a change in our culture through the middle of the 19th century. The beginning of the 19th century, to acknowledge a religion or acknowledge a religious faith was normal. Everybody did. In fact, you were the weird one if you didn't at the beginning of the 19th century. By the time we moved to the middle of the 19th century, it started to move out of the realm of thought because of science. See, we no longer need a God to try to deal with our tragedy. We have science that's going to explain things to us. So that's where we moved. Now we're kind of moving back toward the end of this century. I just listened to Timothy Keller, who did a sermon on this. It was absolutely mind-boggling when you really recognize the trends that we've gone through. Now we're back to, we want to believe in a God because I think we're beginning to see that life is so out of control. But we're sick of the church. It didn't work with the church. They're all hypocrites. It's all screwed up. So we need to do something else. And that means, and we need to have a little more control over it, right? So we've got to create a religion in our own mind that we can control, but yet we can still have that comfort. That's kind of where we are now in this part of our in the end of the 19th century into the 20th. Or the 21st, and going on into the 21st century, it will be that way. And eventually, when science believes that we'll eventually, and these men believed, that we would eventually learn enough of the mysteries of the universe that we will no longer need God. We'll figure it out. Science will figure it out for us, and we'll eventually go, okay, that was just a crutch. We really don't need that. We've got all the answers we need now. If so, we're back to the tragedy again then, aren't we? Because it doesn't matter how many answers they think they get, it's still a tragedy, and there's no hope. So anyway, these men came away, and I'm just to synopsis down here at the bottom, they ended up saying religion is simply a means of gaining power and control over other people, or self-justifying ourselves, meaning that we no longer need to feel guilty because we can just go to church and do a confession, or we can do something nice for somebody, or we can pray and we can feel better about our own sin. So that's really all religion does. It self-justifies, which leads to self-righteousness, or it's a power trip and gives us control. And if you really think about it, and when we get into what we're going to talk about today, which is how the Pharisees affected religion of their time and what it looked like at the time of Jesus, that's really exactly what it was. Judaism really became a self-motivated way to produce your own righteousness and to have control and not feel guilty about stuff, and then have power and control over those that didn't. Right? That's really, if you think about it, that's exactly what we're dealing with here. So that was the mindset. So no wonder these men of our age, closer to our time, came to that conclusion, because that's exactly the kind of religion that Judaism at the time of Christ was reflecting. The kind that uses religion as a form of self-promotion or self-survival, and instead of something different than that, which we're going to talk about. So, I wanted to go, okay, we started out with how has some of this atheistic thinking affected our time, which we could have spent about 6 weeks on that, but aren't going to. And then, so then I wanted to talk about, well then, what were some of the confusion at the time of Jesus that led to some of the conflict between Christ and the religious leaders. And remember that I told you that part of my goal here is that I want to know Christ. I want to know I want to know what the kingdom is about. I want to know the things that have been masked over to me, that I'm distorting myself, that I'm not seeing because I'm seeing something else because I've been set up to believe that, just like the Pharisees were set up to believe some of the things that they believed as their culture influenced them. And so I want to kind of break through that. And then I want to make sure that we see that when it comes down to the time of Christ, we're really talking about Christianity versus Judaism. And Jesus is trying to teach his disciples the difference between the two. And he has got a huge task because he has to break all of the just embedded mindsets of what Christianity had become, just like in our world. As you know, there are some people who, it's embedded now in much of our society. The thought of Christianity now is just repulsive to people because it's just so far, it's been dealt with for so long in a negative way that they don't even want to go there. It was the same thing here. He had to break through some of those major influences and the thinking that what the Pharisees and the religious leaders were holding on to. He had to break all of that. So he had to just come in like dynamite and just try to break loose those chains that had been holding them for so long, but they believed were true. And so his goal was to break through that and invest in his disciples a new message that was so radical and so not tangible and so cosmic as far as being a heavenly concept, a kingdom of heaven, that he had to embed that in them to where when he's gone 3 years later, they could carry it on. And you know what? I've been a Christian for over 40 years now, and I still have doubts at times. Anybody here? It doesn't matter. That's right. It doesn't matter how many times I am convinced. I don't know that I've ever had a teaching that tells me it's not true. Almost all of them tell me it is true, but there's still those things in me that go, it just sounds so absurd. Yeah, it really does. So you can imagine, in 3 years, Christ had to make sure that these apostles grasped it to the point that they'd be willing to die for it. I can't do it in 40 years. He had to make sure that happened in 30 for them. And he had to break the chains of tradition that had gone back for millennia in their life to do it. So part of what I want to do here is, first of all, let us see that to take in the context of Matthew 16 and 17. But I also want us to see that what Jesus disliked and what led to the conflict between him and the religious leaders also is for our benefit, so that we have a picture of what the kingdom is not. And what some of the things is he was trying to break of their hold, and or that we have to as well, because even though it may have looked a little different in their traditions and their culture, the grip that the enemy keeps on our hearts of the deceptions that glazes over our eyes to where we can't see the truth is still the same. So I believe that what Jesus said to these religious leaders and how he felt about the religion of their day, when he expressed it to them, we can take that and go, okay, how are we doing the same things today that we're distorting the real true picture of who he is as Messiah and what his kingdom actually looked like and what I actually am a part of and where my heart should be going. I think we can look at that if we legitimately look at what he hated about what they were doing. I think he made it really clear, and I think he did it for the disciples' sake. He wanted them to see, not only am I telling you what is true, but I'm going to show you what is false about the religion that has been raised up, that you've been raised up with. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is we're going to look at the characteristics of the conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders. And I'm going to have to go into a future chapter of Matthew to do this, but that's okay, because we'll eventually get there. But and it relates to what's happening in chapter 16. So we're going to take this journey about what did Christ hate? What did he just try to blow out of the water regarding who they were? Now we know that in Matthew, we hear it all the time. In the Gospels, he's all the time going, don't listen to the leaven, don't pay attention to the leaven of the Pharisees. They're teaching, and he's like this with them all the time. Every time they do something, there's a conflict. But if we look a little bit closer than that, it should help us to get a better picture then of what he was trying to destroy when it comes to false worship, which is something I believe the church is steeped in today. And I am too, and I want the blinders off my eyes. So, we're going to take a trip into that area. The first thing I want to bring to our attention, which again, it takes me forever to get to the actual lecture notes, doesn't it? Sorry. It's only fair because I have this stuff going through my head 24/7 all week long. I got it. You know, it's got to happen. So I think you have to go back and remember there was something that piqued my attention on this also, and that is that if we go clear back to the time of Moses, the time when God redeemed his people out of Egypt, which is really a picture of salvation, right? Everybody understands that him redeeming them out of Egypt was a picture of salvation. And notice that, I want you to notice that when he got them out of Egypt, he actually freed them. He removed them, so in other words, he saved them out of Egypt. It wasn't when he gave the law that they got saved. They'd already been saved out of Egypt. Do you get what I'm saying? So many times we think that he took them out of Egypt and then they had to get saved by doing the law. No, he'd already saved them. He'd already rescued them. The blood of the lamb on the doorpost. He'd already saved them. Now he's taking them out in the wilderness, and it wasn't to save them again, right? The law was not to save them again. The law was, now that I've got these people and I removed them out of Egypt, I want to turn them into a nation whose hearts reflect who I am. That was his goal with the law. I want them to see who I am, and I want them to become like that. Why? So that they can hold on to it, they can just think they're special and have all kinds of pride about it? No, that wasn't the goal. The goal was so that they have broken hearts that the other nations don't have it. And the other nations need to see it. That was the goal. It wasn't to save them. The law wasn't ever to save them. They'd already been saved out of Egypt. The law was to turn them into a great nation. The law was to turn them into a people who reflected the love of God on a continual basis so that all the nations of the world would be blessed through them. But they missed it. They didn't realize the law is not here to save you. You've already been saved. The law is here to train you to be like me, to see who I really am. But instead, they used it as a form of salvation. You get what I'm saying? I think we're still doing that, guys. I think we're still doing the works that we think we're supposed to do, or the command, or the things that he tells us to do. We're still thinking that's part of my salvation. No, we've already been rescued. Now he wants to turn us into holy people. That's what the commands are for. That's why we obey him. Just like the picture of him with Moses out of Egypt. That's the whole extra problem here. Anyway, bless you. So let's look at. I want to start with there on number 3. Religious confusion at the time of Christ. We know that in our time there's all kinds of religious confusion going on. And so we want to look at what was going on with him and what he was trying to break, so we know what he's trying to break for us as well, trying to get us toward as well. So I took the verse that says, the Pharisees also with the Sadducees came at the beginning of chapter 16, and tempting desired him that he would show them a sign from heaven. Remember in chapter 15 last week, they followed him all the way up north to say, why do you guys not wash your hands? Yeah. See, all right, we can already see the actual ludicrousness of, now there's a word to spell, and to say, the insanity of how far they had taken these boundaries that God had given them to make them holy and turn them into something that they weren't. That's the extent of it. Now we're seeing it again in the chapter 17. And I do want you to know, before we move on, that this is just an ad. They always ads. Is that Matthew speaks more fiercely against the religious leaders than any of the other gospel writers. Luke addresses some of the same things, and they many times have some of the same issues, and Mark will do that as well, but Matthew does it over and over and over again. And he makes sure that he puts in there the derogatory terms that Christ uses to describe them. Where Mark doesn't do that, Luke will mention it a couple times, but you can tell that Matthew has an agenda here as far as we need to understand how heretical these teachings were and how difficult the job was going to be of Christ to break the bonds that they had on the disciples through this religious lie that had been propagating. So that was just an extra there. But so I just want to, we're going to work with mainly Matthew chapter 23, even though we see that it is begun in chapter 16, at that last phrase, which I didn't finish, he answered and said unto them, when it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and in morning it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. O ye hypocrites! And so it begins. He's now using some specific terms that are going to define what he hates about the religion that they have created out of the heart of God. That's what they've done, is they've created a religion out of it. And that's why we want to see this. You can discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. So when I saw that, I thought, obviously, and I thought of, because I'm also teaching Luke, I thought of some of the stuff we just went through in Luke, and how Christ did some of the same situation where he attacked the religious leaders specifically for some of the things that he hated about how they had constructed their religion and how it was influencing the lives of the people. And so I thought, really this is telling me there's some things about specifically what they're doing that Christ hates. And if he hates it, I want to know it, because I want to make sure I'm not doing it. And I think that I am. We just do it in different forms. And we have a hard time because we're relating only to the way that they expressed it, thinking, well, I don't do that. I don't make somebody wash their hands before they eat, although I prefer it, but it is because it's a religious ceremony. I would want somebody healed on the Sabbath. I wouldn't want to wait till, another day just because. So I don't do that. But I do other things that distort the gospel. And remember, those were culturally to them, but the heart behind it is what Christ was actually attacking. Because the laws that were given, some of them were actual laws that were God's laws, they had just distorted them. In what ways do we, in Christianity, do the same thing? Because it's become our tradition. It's become what we thought is the right thing to do. All right, so I'm going to do three particularly. So I want us to go to Matthew 23. And I'm going to read verses, I would like to start at the beginning. So probably I'm not going to get all the way through this. I know, Brad. There it is. There's that clock. And she's like leaning over, like, what? And I haven't even started yet. Okay, so chapter 23. Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. This is significant, what he's saying to them. He's trying to teach them. This is what you need to recognize about the lies that have been raised up in your heritage. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe. So in other words, it's the law. It's what I gave for them to become holy people. But do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. Whoa, there's his first one. And that's your first, on the blank there at the beginning, it says, their hypocrisy is the very first thing, and that was from in chapter 16 that we just read where he called them hypocrites. And we're going to get farther into that, but I want you to know their hypocrisy was one of the first things that he hated, and I want us to know the definition of what that means. So when he said, you hypocrites, and he's going to say it over and over again in Matthew 23, what did he mean by that? Why was that so offensive? And in what ways are we hypocrites? So the definition of a hypocrite is in the context of Greek drama, the term hypocrite was applied to an actor on the theater stage. Most of us knew that. Since an actor pretends to be someone other than himself, hypocrites was applied metaphorically to a person who acts a part in real life, pretending to be better than he actually is. I'm telling you, the three atheists that I gave you, one of their problems is they really felt like, how many times have people said Christians are just hypocrites? They pretend to be something they aren't. You see, it hasn't changed. And Jesus hates it. Jesus hates this. As we'll see, he gets very, very negative about it. But I just want to give you the definition first so that when we get into this, you'll better understand. So they're pretending to be better than he actually is. One who simulates goodness. Someone who simulates goodness. Now that means that you're not really doing it, you're just pretending to do it. This concept of pretended goodness was foreign to Old Testament thought. So there was no word in Hebrew that meant somebody pretending to be something they're not. This is what the Hebrew root came, translated hypocrisy or hypocrite in the King James Version was translated to the LXX, which was the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And it really meant lawless, criminal, godless. And it was parallel to poneros, which is an evildoer. So there's it's not just I'm part in being fake. And that's a distortion of the truth of God and what God was trying to reflect about himself. That's the hypocrite that he's referring to. So, I'm going to go back and finish 23. But it does say, for they say things and don't do them, and that's your first asterisk there, is they say, but they don't do. This is one of the first signs of a hypocrite. Now remember that James says, or that Jesus says, if you love me, you will do what? You'll obey my commands. So that's what he's saying. If they say, but they don't do, we know they don't love, right? Because that's what he said. If you love me, you'll obey. So we've got that down. All right, so back to verse 4. And they tie up heavy loads and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. So, on your next asterisk, and this is just how he is defining what it means to be a hypocrite. First of all, you say, but you don't do. Then they expect acts of righteousness from others that they don't require of themselves. And really what that means is that it's the whole plank and speck dilemma. We see a plank, a speck in someone else's eye because they're not doing something when we have a plank in our own. And that's really what he's saying. We're no different. He hates this stuff. He's talking more negatively and more accusatorily toward these people right now than he ever does. He is actually relating the disgust he feels for their type of religion, is what he's doing. Which means that when we do these things, it is disgusting. And we can see by the response of the rest of the world that they're disgusted by it as well, aren't they? Okay, verse 5. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels of their garments. And that's verse 5. And so your next asterisk is they do outward acts, supposed righteousness, is supposed to be a supposed righteousness, to receive praise from men. Now, I thought this was so interesting. Don't let me forget I'm in verse 5. Because I thought about this. I thought about, when you go back to the law, remember that God brought them out to be holy people. He wasn't bringing them out to save them. So I'm not telling you to do stuff so you could be saved. I'm telling you to do stuff to help you be holy. Yes, for somehow they thought tying something around my forehead and putting something on my arm with a verse in it's going to make me holy.
Yeah. Totally outward.
I'm telling you, does that sound like the church?
Yeah.
If I just go to church, or if I can just read my Bible or read a 1-minute devotion, that's going to make me holy. We do the same thing. And I thought, how interesting that they took that command literally to where they actually put it on their forehead and put it on their arm, and it never changed their heart one little bit, and yet they thought that was what God was requiring of them. That's what a hypocrite does. They see everything as external. I believe that what God was saying in the Old Testament was metaphorical. I don't think he ever intended them to attach something to their body. I think he was trying to say, invest it in, like a metaphor, invest it in your heart so that these things are attached to you all the time. And yet they thought, all I have to do is do the outward law of it, and then I'm good. So I'll just attach these things. They still do it to this day. Gotta wear that on my arm, gotta wear it on my forehead, and now, by golly, I'm a righteous person. That's what a hypocrite does. They do deeds to make them look good. Ladies, that's the complaint that the people out there have against the church. And that's the complaint I have against myself. Because what I say and then what I do when the heat is turned up is two different things. Which means that I've got some things attached to my arms and to my forehead, so they're not into my heart yet. He hated that. He hated this outward show of what he intended to be an inward change. And they were putting it on their outward body thinking, this is going to save me, not knowing that you'd already been rescued. I've already rescued you. I want your heart now. All right. The next one in verse 6. And they loved the place of honor at banquets and chief seats in the synagogues, and respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and being called by men rabbi. They really like that. So it's prideful things. And sometimes we do wear that banner of Christian. and a sense of pride. Other times we hide it because we think somebody's going to reject it. That's a hypocrite. Aren't we double-minded when we do that? Absolutely. I don't see any difference between us and what they're doing here. And yet Jesus is saying, I hate this. Something about the heart has to be different. And that's what I want to find out. That's what I'm on a journey to find out. What am I missing here? Okay, but do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father who is in heaven. And do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. So the next problem he had with this was that they want to be masters, not servants. And you know what that means? That means they want to be in control. Does that sound familiar, ladies? Have you ever wanted control? JC and I were just talking about that. About how we want control. We want to be able to tell people, no, if you do this, this, and this, it'll make everything okay. Because we want to fix it. Or we want to just say, okay, God, you do this, this, and this, and it'll be okay. We want to be in control. We haven't come to the point yet where we realize that humbly we are completely destitute of anything. And it's all dependent on Him. That's what true humility is. They want to be masters, not servants. How many times did He say that? In order to be first, you have to be last. To be the leader, you have to be the servant of all. And He modeled it by doing it, even though He was God. He hates this. He hates this when we think we have control. And then we force other people. I mean, I see that so badly right now with the political thing that's going on, is we want to force them to think like we do. We want to tell them how bad they are so that they'll think like we do. And that our way is the right way. That's hypocritical because we don't even live out our way. And they have no power to live out their way. I won't even go there any further than that. Verse 12. And whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. But woe to, here we go. That was just his prelude to what he was actually going to say to them. Now in the Luke passage, I believe this is actually two different situations, but in the Luke passage, Jesus says these same things, and it's in Luke chapter 11 and 12. He says most of these same things. He's been invited to a Pharisee's house for dinner. And this is what he tells them. He's sitting at his dinner table, and this is what Jesus tells the Pharisees that are sitting there with him. This is how disgusting it is to him. Not much of a dinner guest. I think it probably dulled the mood a little bit.
Yeah.
So, listen to this. But woe to you, that means damnation to you. Woe to you, look out, this is bad. And he is already in a very serious mood here. And remember, his disciples are there, and he wants them to understand what this leads to, and for them to not be like this. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, there's our word. He says it over and over again, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from men, for you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. So the next one is, they close the door of the kingdom to others. Because of your hypocritical, false, fake front, and your traditions that you are determined to hang on to because you want control, and you're not willing to humble yourselves to the reality of what life is and the tragedy that it is, and that you have no control over it, you are going to close the door with your position to others who might come in. Because you're propagating a lie. And he's angry with this. And he's, as I said, and he's sitting in a Pharisee's house telling this to their face. Verse 14, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, while even while a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore you shall receive greater condemnation. And even though it shows the brackets here that may not be in the Matthew one, it is in the Luke one. So he does say it. So he's saying here, you distort justice for the poor. And you know what's so offensive about this to Jesus? You know why he hates this and their attitude toward the poor? Not because Jesus feels sorry for the poor. That's not why. That's why. And guys, that's where we become hypocrites, when we just feel sorry for the poor. Jesus was the poor. He didn't just feel sorry for them, he was one of them. He wasn't just saying, you need to get it in your heart to want to give some things to the poor because you guys have more and you're better, so therefore, at least bring yourself to help the poor. That's not what he was saying. Jesus was one of the poor. Remember, Jesus was born in a stable, right? His parents offered up doves because they were the poorest of the poor and didn't have anything to offer as sacrifice. He was destitute. When he grows up, he says, I have no place to lie my head. The very village he came out of tried to kill him. So he's living somewhere else, and we never know where. We just know that it's not his place. Later on, when he goes to have to share the last supper with them, what does he have to do? He has to borrow a room to have his supper in. Then when he's buried, what does he have to do? He goes in a borrowed tomb. He was the poorest of the poor. So his idea of mistreating the poor and not showing justice was not that we need to feel sorry for the poor. We need to relate and be humble like the poor. Understand what it's like to be somebody who's destitute. Not just go, oh, I feel sorry for them. And I've got it better, and I've apparently done something right, and they've apparently done something wrong. That's hypocrisy. Because you know what? If we understand that we got saved, we are the poor. It doesn't matter economically where we stand. We are the poor. Why do we not have compassion for people that we are one of? And that's what he's saying. And it reminds me of the times that Jesus said, they're like, you're going to heal this guy on the Sabbath? And he's like, you pull your animal out of a well on the Sabbath and you don't have enough compassion on this person that's been blind for his whole life? Do you see that their heart was full of wickedness? It was full of pride. They did not relate. They had no compassion. They had no sense of what God was all about. And we're going to see that in a later verse. Guys, we give most of the time because we feel sorry for people, not because we understand that we're one of them. And that's what he's saying. We're hypocrites. Now don't stop giving to the poor. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we need to understand who we are. Because that's what Jesus is saying here. This isn't just traditions I'm talking about. This is the difference between sin and righteousness. And when we talk about Jesus' form of Christianity next week, we'll see it even more so. Blow our socks off. Okay, number 15, verse 15. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, because you travel on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourself. Wow, can you imagine? He's sitting at the guy's dinner table, who is a Pharisee, who is a Jew, who thinks that he's going to be on the top of the rail when it comes to heaven, and he's saying, you're a son of hell. Okay, then. That had to be an interesting response. Wouldn't you like to be like a bug on the wall or something to watch what's going on here? Exactly. I think Jesus is dead serious, and he's wanting his disciples to see how serious he is. He's wanting them to see the contrast, the complete, total contrast between religion of Judaism that they've made it up to be and what it really is in Jesus' heart, which we'll talk more about next week, as I said. So, I think we're on, you go to extremes to propagate a lie after you distort justice for the poor. Verse 15, you go to extremes. It means you go and you make somebody a proselyte. And a proselyte would not have been another Jew hearing Judaism. It would have been a Gentile that they tried to turn into a Jew. That's what a proselyte is. You proselyte when you are not what they are and you become what they are. That means you've got to come in and be circumcised and go through all the rigmarole. And they would love to do that, bring people in to give them their form of religion. And that's why he said you just made them as much a son of hell as you are. Because now it's all about what am I doing on the outside that makes me acceptable. Verse 16, so you go to extremes to propagate a lie. Verse 16, which as you can see, their next one is actually going to be in verse 23. So I'm going to read a ways before we go over it. Woe to you blind guides, and that's actually on another part of it's number 2 on your notes. Because this is the second name that he calls them. The first one's hypocrites. Now he's talking about blind guides. So we'll get there, but I just want you to know that that's why the 16th is on there. Woe to you blind guides who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple sanctified by the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the offering upon it, he is obligated. You blind men, what is more important, the offering on the altar, or the offering, or the altar that sanctifies the offering? It was ridiculous. Again, they're making the outward part of their involvement holy when everything else wasn't. And really, those other things were holy because the presence of God was there. Verse 20, therefore he who swears by the altar swears both by the altar and by everything on it. And he who swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells within it. And he who swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Now he's back to the hypocrites again. They were blind guides a minute ago, now they're hypocrites. Do you see the seriousness of what he's saying? These are not good terms at all. These are definitely negative terms. So now we're back to verse 23 underneath here, where we did go to extremes to propagate a lie. So in verse 23 he says, you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. Because you know, without justice and mercy and faithfulness, those offerings mean nothing. It's kind of like the 1 Corinthians 13. You can speak in the tongues of men and innovations, but if you don't have love, it means nothing. You can offer as many sacrifices and give as much money as you want to give, and it means nothing if you don't understand mercy and justice and faithfulness. Because that's really what the kingdom of God is about. It's the same thing with us. If we're all about doing stuff in the church, but we don't really understand justice and mercy and faithfulness, it's for nothing. It's hypocritical, is what it is. This opened my eyes to how I'm no different than they are. Brandy should be coming down the stairs here any minute now, right?
It's okay.
Okay, she's freaking. Okay. All right, so that one is they neglect justice, mercy, and faithfulness for ceremony. Basically, they're saying, it's like James says, what good is it to tell somebody to be well fed and then just go your way? Because that's what they're doing. I'll offer this sacrifice, but I won't be merciful towards you or just towards you. And they didn't see it. This is what's so weird. We go, what in the world were they doing? But they did not see this because the lie had been propagated so fully in their mind that they were doing what was righteous. I think we do the same thing. I think we've been influenced the same way, and we want to break away those lies till we see the truth, as hard as it might be. And that's why I said, are you ready to go on this journey with me? Because it's painful. I'm telling you, it's painful. Okay, verse 24. You blind guides, we're back to blind guides again, who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Now we're back to hypocrites. Man, he is on a tirade, is what he is. For you clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. Can you imagine the religious leaders having him say that about them? All these things that he's saying, they thought that's what made them righteous. And he's saying that makes you a child of hell. I think we as Christians sometimes think the same thing, and many are child of hell. Okay, so he says in verses 25 and 26, he is saying you cover over your self-obsession with a guise of righteousness. You pretend to be something you're not, which is exactly what a hypocrite is. So, verse 27, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. And you know what that means to them? They actually literally painted the tombs white so that people wouldn't step up, because you're unclean if you step on a dead body that's in a tomb. So they purposely made them white so you wouldn't step on them. And he's like, you look really good on the outside, but people are still stepping on your dead bones. They can't even see your goodness. Because you're inwardly full, you're still a sepulcher that's full of sin and filth and uncleanness, is really what he's saying. He is attacking every essence of their religion that they think makes them righteous. And so he says, on your notes, it would be dress up what is defiled to make it appear clean. And I shouldn't go off on this, but I'm gonna. And so we're not going to get these done today, clearly. I'm sorry, Brian. What this does to me is when I think about this, and I think about it in myself, and I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, because this is me. I think about how many times I felt frustrated about the fact that I see married couples that will come to church, and they lead a home group, they do communion, whatever it is that they're doing, and then they go home, and they're like venom to each other. Does anybody here know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Or I have the other thing that that I've seen is that I have met with people who will say they'll start telling me the horrible things that the way they can't get along, my husband does all these terrible things or whatever. And when they're around each other, they're verbally abusive to each other, even in front of other people. But we're staying married. We didn't get a divorce. See, we're good because we don't have a divorce. We hate each other and we speak disrespectfully and venomously toward each other, but by golly, we're married. That's a whitewashed tomb, is what that is. Because we have now thought that the tradition of marriage, or what God exalts, trust me, he held up marriage fully, but he also said you stay married because of a commitment of the heart. Not because if you just stay there and act like total pagans in the midst of it, and don't listen to me and won't forgive and won't love and won't have mercy and grace toward each other, that means you're good. It's ludicrous. It is ludicrous when we do that. It is ludicrous. That's why he says, how do you come and say, Lord, Lord, and then treat each other like dirt? He's like, that's like getting bad fruit off of a good tree. It just doesn't, it shouldn't be this way, is what he says. We're whitewashed tombs, guys. This is the hypocriticalness of our religion. Because we're putting on a fake front and making it look really good, when inside we are full of dead men's bones. It's wicked. We would be better off to confess it, say we've done it, and then change. That's what, it's not that we won't do it. It's not that we won't sin. It's not that we won't dislike our husbands. I dare any of you here to say you've never disliked your husband. That would be a lie. It doesn't mean that those things won't happen. It's what we do with those things. Instead of pretending that because I stay married, now it's all good. You can't clean up the bone just because the outside looks good. That's what he's saying. That was just an example. Okay, Brent, I promise. I'm just going to do the last two. No, last one. So, verses 29 through 32. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say if we had been living in the times of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Yeah. Who are they going to kill? Who have they already killed? John the Baptist. They've already killed the last prophet, and they're going to kill the greatest one that ever lived. But we would never do that. That's not who we are. That's like Peter saying, I would never deny you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Obviously, Jesus knew our hearts better than we do. Way clearer, and I think we have to take a look at this. Now, I want you to know that and I said this last week, the last thing I'm trying to do is put a guilt trip on us. Because remember that I said guilt is a wrong motive for righteousness. In fact, it's a futile motive for righteousness. We can respond out of guilt to start doing things out of guilt, but they're going to be short-lived. Because we can endure guilt. And so it'll continue. I'm not saying these things so that we feel guilty and try to change them. I'm saying these things so that we understand who Jesus really is and how desperately we need for him to change us. Because we can't. We can't. So there's no sense of feeling guilty about it. Otherwise, we're just like the Pharisees, who are going to cover it up with something on the outside. We don't want to do that. I want to get into the heart, is what I want to do. And that's why we're doing this. Okay. You can see that the next one, his next name for them is blind guides, which we talked about already. And the third one is that they're a brood of vipers. And I'll try to go over some of that. Did you put all of them up there so that they could fill them in?
We didn't get the hearts with the building of deflect murderous.
Oh, they deflect murderous hearts with the building of shrines. So in other words, we'll just make it all look good with a shrine and then say we would never do that when actually they are doing it. They are killing the prophets still. So I will, and some of these things I've already actually talked about them because of the fact that he's already talked about the blind guides. And so he describes the blind guides. And blind guides in the literal sense is that while they themselves are destitute of a knowledge of the truth, they offer themselves to others as teachers. And that's really what his problem was. Which is why he said to Nicodemus, when Nicodemus came to him and said, you're a leader of Israel and you don't get this? You don't get that you have to be born again? Clearly you've already missed it. That's what he means by blind guides. Those who are unqualified to lead others and therefore lead them to destruction. And I will finish some of this next week, so I can go back over it and finish the last blanks that we didn't get next week. But Brandy's standing at the camera now, so it's time for us to stop. So,
and I gave some leeway.
20 minutes to 12, so it's definitely time for us to stop. Let's pray. Father, you have so much to say to us. There's just so much there. And I thank you for those truths, and I thank you that because of your Spirit, they can be revealed to us when we would otherwise be blind. We want to have the kind of hearts that understand we are destitute without you, and that cry out to you then to give us your righteousness, to give us your eyes to see, to give us your heart to love, to give us your ears to hear, so that we could truly say it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. I pray that you'll do that transformation in us, Father, as we look at the life of Jesus and what he meant by true religion. In Jesus' name, amen.